right, great. Well, looks like it's 7 o'clock. We got lots of people hopping on. I think more people joining. But we will get started here. I see people from all over, including as far away as Hawaii, which is awesome. That's the one opportunity of doing this virtually via Zoom. So hi, everybody. Welcome to our Schoodic Institute evening presentation and conversation with author Colin Woodard, The Past, Present, and Future of Coastal Maine. I'm Nick Fisicelli, President and CEO with Schoodic Institute. Normally we'd be together in Moore Auditorium on the Institute campus, and I'd be welcoming you to Acadia National Park. We would perhaps have just had a lobster stew dinner together in our dining hall, and then we would have had a lovely stroll across campus in the waning light of the evening to the auditorium. Of course, this year is different. This year is all about change and adapting to that change. And this is really, in a lot of ways, the theme of our work at Schoodic Institute, change and adapting to change. And change is the reality. It is the one constant. This is true, and I certainly tried to say that, but it really is true, and it's true regardless of time scale. And if we traveled with paleoecologists over the past 15,000 years, pulling that history from the pollen record in the sediments of a bog right here on the Schoodic Peninsula, we would see a landscape that goes through massive changes, from being under the crushing weight of a continental ice sheet to being 200 feet below the surface of the ocean to being an open Arctic tundra converting to a forest. So really some really big mind-boggling changes that have happened here over the last thousands of years to the ecosystem, and archaeologists too can show the changes in the human use and culture and adaptations of the people that have inhabited this dynamic landscape over these same thousands of years. And these, of course, are the ancestors of the Wabanaki tribes. And then historians of the past 500 years similarly show huge changes here in the coast of Maine as European settlers and Native Americans adapted to the hardships and the many challenges that they confronted. And so not just the past, but the present too abounds with changes, such as seasonal changes. And right now our bird ecology scientists and volunteers are counting the tens of thousands of seabirds that are migrating past Schoodic Point on their way south to their wintering grounds. And so both the past and the present are brimming with change, which is part of what makes them so fascinating to study and follow and to discuss tonight as well. And the one thing we can be sure of about the future is that it too will be full of sweeping changes. And that's, I think, the excitement and the challenge of our work at Schoodic Institute, to be forward-looking and to leading the science to adapt to these changes for a better future for people and the planet. And this science, it's only possible through the stalwart support of our donors and sponsors. And so thank you for helping make the science and solutions happen. And a big thank you to HM Payson for sponsoring tonight's event and supporting our science. You can learn more and support us at schoodicinstitute.org. So with that, I'm really excited for tonight's presentation and conversation, and I'd like to introduce Catherine Schmidt. Catherine is Schoodic Institute's Science Communication Specialist and is herself an author, including the book Historic Acadia National Park, which is a look at the history of science in this great place. So Catherine will be leading this evening's event with Colin Woodard. Catherine, take it away.
Thanks, Nick. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. A few logistics before I introduce Colin. You can put any questions that you have for Colin. We'll have time for Q&A towards the end of the hour. So use the Q&A function for questions for Colin. If you have technical issues, comments, or questions for myself, Nick, Kim, or other hosts, you can use the chat box. You can also use the chat to just let us know where you're coming from. You are all muted on your audio and your video, and so the chat and the Q&A are your ways to interact with us. Myself will be going mute while Colin is speaking. And then a final note, we are recording tonight's event. We will post it to our website which will be from YouTube, and we will share the link with all of you after the event. Now it's my honor to introduce Colin Woodard. Colin is a New York Times bestselling author and an award-winning journalist. He's currently contributing editor at Politico, state and national affairs writer at the Portland Press Herald and Maine Sunday Telegram. He's won a George Polk Award. He's been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and he was named 2014 Journalist of the Year by the Maine Press Association. He's also written for the Christian Science Monitor, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and the San Francisco Chronicle. He's reported from more than 50 foreign countries, 7 continents, and lived for several years in Eastern Europe. He's a graduate of Tufts University and the University of Chicago. He is from Maine and lives in Midcoast, Maine currently. And he's also the author of 6 books. His first book, Ocean's End, Travels Through Endangered Seas, is how I came to know of Colin's work from my own writing and studying of the history and science of the ocean. The Lobster Coast, Rebels, Rusticators, and the Struggle for a Forgotten Frontier, which I think he'll be drawing upon for tonight's talk. It's a cultural and environmental history of coastal Maine. Other books include The Republic of Pirates, American Nations, A History of the 11 Rival Regional Cultures of North America, American Character, A History of the Epic Struggle Between Individual Liberty and the Common Good, and his brand new book, hot off the press, I think is out maybe this week, Union, The Struggle to Forge the Story of United States Nationhood. And we'll be sure to share links to some of his recent articles that I think he'll be drawing on, as well as where you can get copies of the books. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, Colin. We're really looking forward to talking with you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you for the Schoodic Institute for having me, and for all of you for attending. I wish we could be meeting in person south of Winter Harbor, but at least this does give the opportunity for people who don't live nearby to be joining the talk. I have one housekeeping suggestion. We have over 230 participants online right now, which is excellent, but many of you may see a little bit of lag from time to time, especially in Down East Maine where your bandwidth goes down. One thing I found that sometimes helps when you get loaded up is if some of the audience members, if you want to hit your stop video part, so your own video isn't going out, it may free up your bandwidth so you don't get the same lagging effect, but you should still be able to see me. And if that happens with weeds out the demands that are coming in and out, that should work really well. If you want to have your visual again, just click to turn your video back on, and all will be well. Well, thank you again. I wanted to speak a little bit tonight about, well, it's Maine's bicentennial. Happy birthday, Maine. We got you a global pandemic. But I wanted to describe a little bit about the backstory to Maine's statehood and really to Maine's culture in general, which is the story that Lobster Coast tells, and is also the topic of a series I wrote for the Press Herald back in March called Colony, about the formative experiences of Maine that led to statehood and in many ways shaped our state and have continued to shape it on a cultural and economic and social level. I came to this exploring of Maine's past because, like many of you, I grew up here. And one of the experiences of being a Mainer is to encounter people when out of state, or at parties with a lot of summer visitors or out of state visitors, and somebody asks where you're from, and they say, oh, you're from Maine, oh my gosh. And oftentimes people get this sort of dewy look in their eyes. Oh, Maine, we love Maine, it's so special, it's so unique, it has all this character, it's very distinctive, the people are self-starters, it's so interesting. And the frustrating thing I always found when I was growing up is, while people would often say these things, nobody really fleshed it out very well. Like, if it's distinctive, in what ways is it distinctive? If the people in the place have special characteristics, well, what are they? And what are the forces that shape them and made this place seem unusual to visitors and to many of us who live here alike, especially once you travel around and start realizing that Maine is unlike a lot of other places in the country. And so that was the quest that I went on when I ended up writing Lobster Coast. was to figure out why that is. And I'd been a Balkan and East European history major. I've been living in that region for much of my 20s and much of the 1990s, covering the everything that happened there, from the transition from communism to the ethnic conflicts that happened and the environmental degradation and powerful environmental issues that were affecting the place, which led me to write that book, Ocean's End, on the oceans. But I hadn't explored and studied, although I was a history major, I hadn't explored and studied colonial US history until I set out on this quest to understand Maine. And what I discovered was that my background in the Balkans was actually rather useful for understanding the backstory to Maine and later to the North American continent generally, the deeper history. Because, if you go back far enough and you look at the history of the various colonies, at one time, all of them were extremely distinct from one another. I mean, so distinct that they were often at war. Virginia, settled by the younger sons of English colonial gentry from the southern counties of England, the sons who weren't going to inherit the property, founded a society trying to recreate the manorial system, the semi-feudal system of the English countryside they'd come from, was at war and had a whole naval battle with nearby Maryland across the bay, which was the fiefdom of a Catholic lord, the Lords Baltimore and the Calverts. And in fact, their coat of arms still emblazons the Maryland flag today. You get closer up into our area of the world, and the differences between New York under the Dutch and New England were also profound. At the beginning, what's now New York City and its environs was a little Dutch outpost posted at the end of Manhattan Island at a time when the Netherlands in the 1640s and 1650s was the most sophisticated society in the Western Hemisphere, in the Western world. The center of banking and finance and publishing and all of those things that we now associate with New York City were true of Golden Age Amsterdam at the time the tiny village of New Amsterdam was founded in Manhattan. And it was from the beginning modeled after Amsterdam itself. Even when it was a tiny village of 600-700 people, it was this global, city-state, a commercial trading colony, multi-ethnic and multi-religious. There were, Swedes and English and Turks and Native Americans living within its walls, and that was fine. The Dutch were a minority from the beginning. It was cosmopolitan, and it was all, the efforts of democracy and representative government weren't that important, but innovation and freedom of conscience and inquiry and all of those things were. So you can imagine how the Dutch in this little city of theirs, when they looked across the Hudson River at the New England colonies, probably frowned a bit, because the early Puritans were none of these things. A much more, homogenous and perhaps navel-staring society, a group of people who believed themselves to be in a covenant with God, the early Puritans, to do certain things in the world, to carry, an errand into the wilderness, to put a light on the hill, to create a more perfect society. And the Dutch looked at all this as being a little bit backwards and peasant-like and called the New Englanders Jan Kaas, which loosely translated meant cheeseheads. But the phrase ended up sticking. The New Englanders heard Yankees and have kept it ever since. But more to the point, the differences between the people who founded Massachusetts, those early Puritans, and the people who first founded the colonial and settler project in what's now Maine were also completely distinctive people. And that fact shaped Maine's history and people and continues to shape it rather profoundly. Now, the key is that what was originally Maine, which was a separate colony, the province of Maine ultimately, was founded by a wayward feudal knight, a guy named Sir Ferdinando Gorges. And Gorges was on one side of the emerging cultural and political struggle in the English Empire, as it were, in the early 1600s. And that was a struggle between the old way of doing things, the conservative way of doing things, the sort of England of guilds and feudalism and vassals and peasants and, knights errant, the sort of Tolkien and King Arthur kind of hangover of the way England should be, versus the modernizing version, the ideas that were coming across the English Channel, especially into the eastern parts of England that were just across the Channel from the Netherlands, Calvinism, things that we would consider to be the beginnings of capitalism, a lot of people with freehold land, a lot of market forces that were frustrated by all of these neo-feudal arrangements and were pushing for what we would consider modernity. But in the early 1600s, it's the early modern period, right? England is standing on the threshold between that old sort of feudal world and the new modern one. It's not quite in either place at the time that Maine is explored and founded in the first decades of the 17th century. Now, I tell you all this because Sir Ferdinando Gorges was very much on the conservative neo-feudal side of things. And this was to his political advantage in that era because it led the king, who trusted him, to bequeath him a vast feudal preserve, his own dominion, essentially, that extended from just north of Virginia, in theory, all the way through to Newfoundland. It all belonged on paper to Sir Ferdinando Gorges, without reference to the English Parliament, just went from the king to him. And Gorges, with the king's backing, had a great plan for all this. He was going to help the king shore up the English colonial space and the English empire for the old way of doing things. And he was going to do this by creating an Anglican royalist, neo-feudal society in the New World. His plan was to take this vast dominion and create the world's biggest property subdivisions. He was going to divide them into huge pieces that would be given out to dukes and called duchies. And then those would be subdivided into counties for counts and down into baronies and farthings and all the way down until you finally got to the little peasant serfs working on the land and handing their tithes up and forward through the system. And the king thought this was great, what a great way to shore up the empire, and so had backed Sir Ferdinando Gorges and his plans. But there was a problem with all this. Sir Ferdinando Gorges did not ever actually come to the New World to oversee his plans. Instead, he guided all of his imperial efforts, which lasted for decades and ultimately became focused on what became known as the province of Maine. He did all of this from England, from his own home in Plymouth Fortress. He guided all of these experiments. He sent out people to act as his lieutenant governors in the field, including, his nephews straight out of college and second cousins and the like, giving them orders that became increasingly outrageous because Sir Ferdinando Gorges didn't have a very good idea of what was really going on here. And that led to Maine, early Maine, that had been in which Gorges had been a co-investor. There was an attempt to colonize the Maine coast, the failed Popham colony in 1607 to 1608 that Gorges and his business partner, Sir John Popham, were involved in. But all of these came to naught. And Gorges was left with a chain of fishing stations, and by the 1630s, with just a handful of colonists. 700 or 800 of them by the 1630s, after he'd worked for the better part of a generation and gone through multiple fortunes trying to settle the Maine coast. And many of those colonists were accidental colonists. Half of them were the Pilgrims who'd been on their way from their exile in the Netherlands to New Netherland, to what's now New York City, and had gotten afraid of the shoals off Cape Cod along the way, and had ended up sailing, coming to the inside of Cape Cod and founding the Plymouth colony, which they named Plymouth because they were paying homage to Sir Ferdinando at Plymouth Fortress, who they had to retroactively ask for permission to be there because they were squatters. So that was Sir Ferdinando's colony and plan. But as time went by, he was starting to fall further and further behind in his ambitions to colonize this land, and therefore to increase its property values and attract more people to buy land from his company, and to make the king proud and to settle North America on the lines of the old way of doing things. And this might have been okay, except that as time went on and he became more desperate, he stopped paying close attention and doing vetting of the people that he was handing out his property deeds to. And this led him coastal Maine and the interior begins to diverge because railroads did come to some of the mill towns, but the transformation for coastal Maine in particular, the oldest settled part and where most people still lived, was rather profound. Maine suddenly was not at the center of things, right? In the transatlantic trade times and the colonial times, Maine was right on the highway between America and England. You passed right by, like mile 24, your travel plaza, Damerscove and Monhegan were right there. And the first places you made landfall in when you arrived from England. And that's why all the oldest towns were out on peninsulas. It was an enormous advantage. You were in the middle and thick of things in world commerce. Suddenly, with the railroad age, Maine was what it is today, a backwater, out on the edge, east of everything else, not really on the way to anything, because nobody knows about New Brunswick, right? They think, New Brunswick is, where Rutgers is, not a Canadian province. And so Maine ended up falling for all these reasons into a kind of catastrophic recession and long-term sort of depression. It became a backwater, and a backwater like we're accustomed to today. And it was sort of a 150-year-long depression, right? Parts of the Maine coast still haven't come out of this economic depression, right? It's been going on for generations. All the possibilities and promise of the first half of the 19th century coming to naught with this economic collapse. Many of the mid-coast counties, Waldo and Knox and so on, emptied out in population. They actually had a reverse net population between 10-year censuses in the second half of the 19th century as people fled for better prospects. The coast was deindustrializing and depopulating. There was an Ohio fever where people were leaving en masse to try to get to that topsoil that they'd all heard about, and that maybe some of their returning Civil War soldiers had told them about. And there was the beginning of the end of the golden age for Maine. Well, the last point I'm going to raise for everybody to bring home is that by an irony of history, it was at this time in the late 19th century when Maine was deindustrializing and suffering this economic and demographic collapse that the outside world first discovered the pleasures of the Maine summer. And it was led first by the people who in the 19th century had time off in the summer. It was college professors and the leading plutocrats and Gilded Age barons at the height of the Gilded Age. The summer trade was essentially started by Rockefellers and Roosevelts and Morgans and Vanderbilts and so on, coming to places like Mount Desert Island and Bar Harbor and creating the rustic mansions. They'd come, though, because they'd seen these grand paintings that some of these romantic landscape painters in the early and mid 19th century had created, Frederick Church and others, big dramatic, pictures of Somme Sound or of, Mount Desert Light and, the sun coming down and crazy waves crashing. And people saw these paintings in, Baltimore and Richmond and Boston and Philadelphia and New York and said, oh, I would love to go see such places. And they came and they did. And when they got off in places like, what became Bar Harbor, they were flabbergasted. They absolutely loved it. They believed they'd found an Eden. And the reason for that is that, they were leaving a rapidly transforming urban areas. Many times they actually owned the factories and industrial installations that were transforming life in these cities and drawing in large numbers of immigrants from other parts of the world who worked in these places, which were producing large amounts of soot and pollution at a time when there was no, environmental protection yet, and when, sewage and septic systems were not up to par, and when people were still, dumping chamber pots out on the street. The cities were becoming, especially in summertime, rather dangerous and petulant places. People tried to get away. If you were a well-heeled person, you went to a spa for your health to get away from the cities. And many people, would go there because you weren't supposed to be, taking a vacation. You had to pretend you were there for exercise or health. Many people left and did that who had the opportunity to. But also the cities were transforming in a ethnographic and demographic sense. Suddenly there were people from strange places speaking odd languages. Who's ever heard of somebody speaking French, right? Or Gaelic, or, I don't even know if all these people are Protestants. Oh my gosh, I don't think they're all Congregational or Anglican. I thought I saw a Jewish person. Oh my, the whole world's coming to an end, right? What happened to the Anglo-Protestant New England we all remembered from our childhood? people would say in the late 19th century. You know, if only we could find another place that was like we remember. Oh yes, like we remember, like when we were kids, where everyone was, you know, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, and taciturn, and they went to their meeting halls, and they went down the town green, and they were Anglo-Protestant and taciturn. Yes, that would be great. I wish we could find such a place. And then they got off the boat in the Maine coast in places like Bar Harbor and Castine and Booth Bay, and there it was. A whole bunch of people who were Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, and very, very taciturn, getting more taciturn by the day. Because with the coast deindustrializing, none of these immigrant groups who were, you know, disturbing and changing life in the cities and responsible for things seeming out of control, none of them were coming there. And all the people there were very much living the way they had because they had no other choices. And so many of the early summer trade was capitalizing on this. Here was a place that had dodged the excesses of the age on the eastern seaboard. You know, a place where you could recharge your batteries, where life is as it should be. And they built big rustic mansions where they could imagine themselves living in an earlier and calmer age, and would spend their summers there in these big rambling houses and mansions, often called cottages. And you can see the echoes of all that, you know, today in the way people think about Maine. But it began at the very beginnings of the tourism trade as being that way. And it affected the development of these places because, remember, these are among the most powerful people in the country, or in many ways in the world, living among people who are among the poorest in the country, right? If you go back and you look at government statistics for per capita income and you adjust it for the cost of living, because it's so very expensive to keep yourself warm in the winter in Maine, Maine would often, according to federal government statistics, you know, be 47th, 48th, 49th last among the 50 states in per capita income, you know, beating out, you know, Mississippi and Alabama in the, you know, be the poorest and most downtrodden spot in the country. And so the power dynamics were, you know, enormous, an upstairs, downstairs society. You know, Mainers in places like Mount Desert Island, of course, valuing the arrival of the tourists, of the summer cottagers, because there were temporary jobs to be, you know, maids and gardeners and to teach the kids to sail and to maintain these things. But it was also echoing all of those colonial relationships, right? Where, you know, things were formed like the Northeast Harbor, you know, swimming club, where native Mainers, meaning, you know, European origin Mainers, were not allowed to even apply for membership. You know, those kind of things happen and those dynamics. But also, there was intervention by the rusticators to ensure that their Edenic place was not transformed. So they fought against the creation of infrastructure and industry in many of these towns to prevent the contagion of the modern age from overtaking their summer idyllic, you know, spots. Thus, the effort to stop, you know, the creation of a lobster cannery in Southwest Harbor on Somme Sound, or to stop the use of automobiles on MDI or on Islesboro, a 14-mile long island, even preventing automobiles from being used at times when the summer rusticators weren't there, which was, you know, 10 months of the year. Trying to stop the building of bridges connecting Orr's Island and Bailey Island to the mainland, or even more so, the bridge at Bath to replace the ferry in the 1920s over the Kennebec. You go back and read the Bath newspapers, all the letters coming in from the rusticators all up and down the mid-coast about how the mid-coast will be destroyed if a bridge is built there, and they will pack up and leave. Many did pack up and leave. When automobiles were finally allowed in Castine, many rusticators dismantled their mansions and moved them to St. Andrews, New Brunswick, to escape the automobile, even though they were using automobiles when they were home. So you can see how that dynamic happened and how it created a further tension, that even as the summer trade was valuable, it was carrying on the same themes of the colonial period in many respects, in that there was a tension between the interests of the year-round people who were there and the interests of the outsiders who in fact had a lot of the power in these locations, that only increased and perpetuated these colonial era, post-colonial feelings, right? Because Maine is in many ways a post-colonial society because of this long relationship and its reinforcement in the late 19th century, right? With all of those characteristics, right? Defiance, pride, self-doubt, you know, insecurity, a lack of faith in things being possible, right? That is sort of a culture of some level of defeatism that I, as, you know, having grown up here, see all the time. And that's one of the things that has most confounded Maine's development today. And it's unfortunate because it doesn't need to be so anymore. with the change in technology and the arrival of the internet, we're not really a backwater anymore. We can be as plugged in as anywhere else. Geographic isolation is no longer a fundamental fact of life in Maine. And also, we're not second rate and unable to do these things. We just often, as a culture, think we are, that things won't work here. We couldn't possibly have built, North Conway, New Hampshire, over the border in Maine, right? You couldn't possibly have a Freeport, set of outlet stores and 6 Sugarloaf Mountains and, amusement parks like you have on Old Orchard Beach and create a year-round community like that. No one would ever come, right? It's too cold, right? We wouldn't believe that that would happen. And so in a sense, it doesn't. And so those are some of the legacy of the colonial era that still affects the state today. Now, the divide can be very large, right? You can often see, in your classic division between multi-generational Mainers who've been on the place in this town for a long time. And Maine is unusual in the respect that because we were settled very early, extending back into the early 17th century, and then had this economic collapse, in many cases, the same families who came with the original land patents from the king in the 1730s or the 1780s or the 1790s or whenever on the spectrum of settlement up and down the coast were often in the 1980s still there, still not only in the same towns, but often on the same pieces of land. It created these almost European-like notions, which don't exist in much of the rest of the United States. These sort of, things that have the aspects of nationhood, right? Not nation statehood, but the idea that, my people have been here and they're tied to this land, blood and soil and links that go back in history, and events that happened centuries ago happened to my family and my people. Those kind of, European ideas actually sort of exist in a prototype here in Maine, in a protean form here in Maine, where they don't really in other parts of the US, because the other parts of the US that were settled so early were transformed by immigration so rapidly, whereas in Maine, in living memory, you still had those links. And that only sort of emphasized these things, where somebody could come when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s and come to a town in mid-coast Maine or down east and go and see this, house, weather-beaten farmhouse sitting in a field of wildflowers, and the sun's hitting it just right and the paint's peeling off, and it's like so absolutely beautiful the way it catches the land and is oriented towards the southern exposure of the sun. It's beautiful, says a visitor, rightly so. Now let me get out a canvas and, paint a picture of it. It's Wyeth-esque. Whereas a neighbor down the road, would say, it's the Jones farm. It failed. They lost everything. He hung himself. They moved to Ohio, right? They're both seeing the same thing, but seeing it from completely different points of view. And that's the big divide that formed in many Maine communities, over the last years of the 20th century. That divide between, those who were trying to, earn an income and survive on the Maine coast, and those who were coming to the Maine coast because Maine had dodged, had rightly dodged the excesses that had happened in overdevelopment and other things in the East Coast cities. And people were valuing the fact that there was, open land and a sense of place and history and the rootedness that comes with that. But at the same time, not wanting it to be changed, right? The idea that, everyone should telecommute. There should be, no factories here. We should roll up the roads and everyone will commute to the jobs they used to have in San Francisco. Whereas local people would say, gosh, we need jobs, build a 15-lane highway straight to the sea, pave over the bay, put in a LNG plant and add a casino on top. Maybe a job will fall off because we really need one, right? My children would be 9th generation in this town, but there's nothing here for them, right? And that's a tragedy, because that divide, that not understanding that both points of view are valid, but also that they're actually compatible. You can do both those things. We can protect the unique things the Maine coast has and the things that are going to become rarer and rarer elsewhere in an ever crowded world, while at the same time managing to create an economy and opportunities that allow people who've grown up and not been elsewhere and not brought their social networks or their job that they can, remote connect into with them, can continue to live and thrive in these places. And that's sort of the lesson of Lobster Coast that I try to bring to audiences when I speak to them. I'm happy to say that now that we're sort of 15 years on since Lobster Coast came out, that that I see that lesson being implemented to a degree that it wasn't, in 2004 or 2005 when the book came out in many parts of the coast. I think people are starting to understand that, and there's been progress made, which is something I'm very happy about. Anyway, so that's the backstory I wanted to share with all of you about Maine. And now I'm going to stop and open it up to questions.
Thank you, Colin. I'm sure if all 230 people who have joined us from the audience, the applause would be thunderous. That was great. And I shared the link with our audience of the Colony 6-part series that you did in the Press Heralds. And, in the Lobster Coast, we have a couple questions from the audience, but I have some questions for you.
Sure.
First, you do talk about this rootedness. I think it's actually a scene on Monhegan where you're describing this idea of rootedness, and then you started your talk about the wistful look that people get in their eyes when you say that you're from Maine, which I'm familiar with, and then of course ended with this idea of rootedness. And so I just wonder, is that a virtue or a fault or both?
The rootedness? Well, it's both. I mean, the rootedness is enormously valuable, right? Something about that is what attracts people, right? They sense and feel that, as they say, that, it's a distinct place, that it has character, that it seems authentic, right? The people seem authentic, the civics seem so. And that's because it is, right? It's grown out of generations of development and linkages and, awareness of the land and space by necessity, not by, idealism necessarily. That people are self-sufficient because they had to be. When we just deindustrialized along the coast, you had to find a way to survive and be tinkerers and self-starters and inventive and hard workers, because nobody was just going to hire you on. Usually you had to develop your own way, and that those are all valuable things, and things that are scarce items in much of the world and in much of this country. But we also, with it has come the hangover of the colonial period. The idea that, we're second rate, we can't do it ourselves. Yeah, maybe I can scrappily hold my family together, but I'm not going to build a big, thing or empire or expand it because it can't be done here. That we don't believe in our, musicians and, rock bands or whatever until they move to Boston or embraced, by the outside world. And then suddenly love them, right? All of that, because somehow things that are Maine grown are just not believed in until they get external validation. Why is that? Why do we have that aspect of things? That's the unfortunate part, the risk aversion and uncertainty and fundamental self-doubt that we have as a culture that holds back our economy. I think many people who have been involved in business development will, nod their heads when I talk about that, that they see it all the time, that sort of a cultural aversion. And also, it's created because of our rootedness. Our, communities don't convene with each other very easily. One of the things I was brought onto Politico to write most of a series called What Works back in 2015 and 2016. That was big magazine articles, one a month, big 5,000 worders with in-depth history and people and narrative from different places in the country where something had happened in a metro area, an urban area that was so amazing the rest of the country needed to know about it. And it was all sorts of things. How did Denver from scratch build an entire public transportation system, which cost a gazillion dollars to transform and save the city? How did Milwaukee take a falling apart 19th century contaminated industrial zone and turn it into a wonder, 21st century technology park that everyone wanted to go to? How did, the world, by some metrics, the most dangerous neighborhood in the country in the 1990s, Cincinnati's over the Rhine, get transformed into, the coolest place everyone wanted to go to, all those things. What I discovered by accident, I was just looking for the criteria of, where is something that's head turning? Here's how Albuquerque, New Mexico is helping homeless people. That's a way you never heard of before. What I ended up noticing in all the places I went to that had something like this going on that was head turning is they were able to convene. Somehow something about the culture in that metro area made it possible for the suburbs and the city to convene, that the Democrats and Republicans were able to convene, that the plutocrats, the Chamber of Commerce, Fortune 500 types, the old money philanthropists, and the punk rockers, and the scrappy internet building startup people were all able to somehow link together in the same room and pull in the same direction. There was usually some shared public good that everyone knew their broad community or metro area needed to move forward, an airport, an industrial zone, a public transportation, whatever it was, that the private sector wouldn't have the right incentives to produce itself, although everyone knew they needed it, and the public sector wasn't capable of doing by itself. So it was often this convening of these partnerships that ended up being public and private and all the rest. But what just bowled me away being from Maine is to sit amongst these people and see them all conversing and getting along without a lot of static across geographic areas and Politico. That just doesn't happen in Maine. Not only because we're not good at meeting with people on a county level and doing those kind of things, but also there's no conveners the way there were in these communities. There were people in all these places in Roanoke, Virginia, and in Salt Lake City, and in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and in Des Moines. There were people who obviously everyone would turn to, who could convene all these people and bring them together to pull in one direction. And that's something we don't really have and have never had here. So those are the disadvantages. And they come from our sort of colonial atomized heritage, and also our rootedness that makes each community, like, the people in Boothbay and the people in Boothbay Harbor will not get along in anything, right? Which is not actually the way things in most of the country aren't delineated quite as strongly. That home rule has a double edge. And these are all things that, we can move beyond, but we need to recognize them before we can move on from them. And, that's what I hope that we do, because we have so many advantages here in Maine. We need to kind of, culturally and psychologically, get out of our own way so we can do all of these things.
And do you think acknowledging that history that you're trying to bring to light, just acknowledging that we don't, this idea of a shared history is a bit of a myth, and where we've come from, that's a way to kind of help envision the future. I mean, at Schoodic, we're all about sort of looking at environmental change and not just studying it, but trying to engage people a little bit, to some extent as convening, but also just as citizens and sort of contributing to observing and documenting some of the change. And so, I just wonder, how can we use that as an asset? And I see it that there's this people really, it's something that we share, is the love of the place that is Maine. And is that a place, where is the place to start from once we acknowledge the history?
Yeah, love of place and civic engagement, right? You at your classic, municipal level confrontation at town meeting over whatever it is. I mean, there aren't very many apathetic people, right? People are involved. They care about what's going to happen, and they're very engaged, even if they're sort of at loggerheads with one another. But that civic engagement is in and of itself a valuable and rare thing in this world. And to be able to harness that, to be able to find ways where you convene and build trust to all move forward, right? Where you can kind of see where each camp's point of view is and successfully convene to do all the things at once, right? There are many ways in which you can have your cake and eat it too. You can have the economic development and protecting the environments and the sense of place all at the same time, but it requires trust to be built, and trust at a municipal level. I think, institutions and places are getting better at that. Civic organizations, when I was growing up, places like Boothbay, where my mom's family's from, there would be one set of institutions that the from away people were on the boards of and involved in, and another set of institutions and clubs that the native families were from, and never the two shall meet or talk to each other. Now they're cross-pollinated, right? The multi-generational family representatives are on the board of this thing, the Opera House, and the other people are involved in the Rotary. It's mixing up much more in a way that builds trust and linkages and makes it possible for the community to convene and move forward on these things. But yeah, it's not always easy, but that is the path.
So I could keep talking with you, but I want to make sure we get to some questions that are shared, and one of which touches on something that I wanted to ask about. This question is from Deirdre Whitehead. she asks the 1640s. So who was living in Maine and what was going on with the tribes during that time? And then sort of a follow-up question is, why would the settlers feel that they had a natural right or title to the land in Maine?
Oh, the settlers in the 1640s?
Yeah.
Well, because the assumption by English people generally was that the indigenous people of North America were not civilized. They were savages, right? Romans thought of themselves as they're civilized people, us, and there are savage people who are not civilized. And the savage people, the rules of, rule of law and fair play don't apply because they're less human or organized than we are. Well, that same experience came to England in its first colonial projects in the late 1500s. Just prior to the colonization of Maine, England had its first imperial conquest, that of the north of Ireland, of Ulster and the Pale. And there was that same language was employed. The Irish were savages and not civilized. And therefore the various, 10 commandments and Christian ethics didn't apply in your struggle to wipe out the Irish guerrilla armies that were there. You bring in Scots Irish, people from lowlands of Scotland to put them down, hard-headed borderland people, became the Scots Irish. And then later, not long thereafter, the same individuals involved in the conquest of Ulster were among the first settlers, explorers, and colonizers in Maine and New England in the early 1600s. The same individuals were involved. And so what they saw on the early reconnaissance missions, when you're reading the letters of like the Weymouth Party in 1605, who reconnoitered the coast, and Martin Pring and others, they're saying when they start describing the Micmac and Wabanaki they're encountering, they're drawing parallels over and over again to the Irish, right? The Wabanaki are wearing, sealskin trousers like the Irish wear. The Wabanaki are speaking a language that sounds to us like Gaelic. They're comparisons over and over again. The savages was a borrowed term they'd used on the Irish. In fact, I believe it was the Weymouth Party brought with them a translator, a Welsh guy, because they were convinced that obviously the savages must speak a form of Gaelic and that the Welshmen would be able to translate with the Wabanaki they encountered. So what I'm saying is, before the English even showed up, in a way the die was cast in the English framework of mind. The savages were savages and the normal laws would not apply. And it was an antagonistic relationship to some degree from the beginning. And once you added in the Puritans at Massachusetts Bay, it got much worse because remember, the Puritans believed they were covenanted people, right? Like God had chosen them and they had a mission from God and they would be judged collectively if they'd succeeded and failed, punished or rewarded as a group. So it really mattered that everyone in the group was following the plan, that if anyone was deviant, you had to police them yourselves or else everyone would get punished and that would be bad. So, you kept an eye on everyone. If you're supposed to wash your car every Wednesday, the person who's not doing that is going to get thrown in the stock. And people who are going out into the fields, you had to kind of keep an eye on them because temptation's everywhere. And Calvinists believed that, humans were inherently wicked, right? But if you went out into the forest, nobody could see you and maybe you're hanging around with witches, we'd better try you for that. And you ended up with witch trials and stuff. Imagine what they thought of the Native Americans who weren't showing up in the congregational meeting hall. They weren't washing their cars on Wednesday. They were out there in the woods where no one can see them with all the temptations of Satan. They must be Satan's minions or aligned with them, right? There became theological reasons to distrust and see in the worldview of a Manichaean world, God on one side and Satan on the other, the uninhibited Native Americans with their apparently looser relationship structures and all that were seen as being very suspect in a way that led to these genocidal wars. So that only made it worse. Now, all of the European powers had, unpleasant colonial postures, but contrast that with the way the French approached things. And the French controlled the eastern half of Maine until the 1760s, at least nominally, and of course, colonized Port Royal and Quebec and all the rest. Their approach was entirely different. They came with the assumption that the tribal leaders of the Native American tribes they encountered were princes that they would treat with and try to get to be vassals of the King of France and treat them as fellow princes and aristocrats. And so that was the general posture, right? They would ignore the ordinary, tribal members as being, of people of no consequence, but their leaders would be very important, and they saw them as allies, and they would try to build, sort of allied relationships where the French might claim Eastern Maine, but really the Passamaquoddy and Penobscots were there and were their French subjects and allies that they would work with. You would intermarry. The Baron Castine, the most influential person in this part of the French Empire, married a Penobscot chief's daughter and had children who were bicultural, who could speak both languages. So what I'm saying is the approach was very different, but we set off on the English set off on a bad foot to begin with.
So you've touched a little bit on a question from Sandra Curtis about what was going on specifically in down East Maine during the colonial period. And she also wants to know about sort of, can you take what you're just talking about a little bit further up until the War of 1812 in down East specifically?
Yeah, so because down East Maine, your side of the Penobscot was claimed by New France, was part of New France and claimed by France. It was contested, right? There was the English and French both believed they should control it, but nobody really did. It remained Wabanaki territory, right? The Wabanaki tribes were generally aligned with and had accepted alliances with the King of France and in some fashion or another. There were a few French representatives here and there, but largely it remained Wabanaki land with French backing until the defeat of the French in the final of those colonial wars in the 1760s when the English annexed it. So, it was, but from European point of view, sparsely populated, almost unsettled. So that, for instance, another book I did was on the Great Caribbean Pirates, Blackbeard and his gang, a history back to the archives to figure out what made them tick. Well, down East Maine was one of the places that pirates in that golden age of piracy time would come to hide out in, because it was a place where there would be no prying eyes. Many of the people in Blackbeard's pirate gang would come after raiding ships in Boston and go hide out in down East Maine precisely because it was effectively not yet colonized and you could hide out in places. There's this whole story in the general history of the pirates, the 1724 history of sympathetic to the pirates, which built much of our pirate myth. There's a whole story of Sam Bellamy sailing up the Machias River to what's now Machiasport and supposedly building a fort in a pirate republic called Libertalia and hanging out there for a while. Now, we know it wasn't Sam Bellamy because there was no time for him to do that, but it was probably another pirate, a guy named Labuse, who went and did all those things. So, my point is that it was contested, somewhat war-torn, primarily Wabanaki controlled, with various incursions and visitors that come whenever there's a sort of, buffer zone, what we would consider today to be sort of a strategic vacuum on the landscape between empires.
Thanks. I think that will definitely help. Down East is a very unique part of Maine, and so we often, I think, are absent from even more statewide histories. So appreciate your attention to the region.
And the other thing that, once English settlement began after the end of the French and Indian War in the 1760s, 1770s, 1780s, which is when most of your town histories will start, with the arrival of people from Massachusetts or other parts of Maine, and the O'Briens and everybody else showing up in Machias and in Eastport and the like, that beginning of history from the English point of view. It was quickly discovered that, the land is very difficult to grow crops on compared to the western part of Maine, right? The Wabanaki, the earliest explorers, when there was first contact by people like Weymouth and Champlain, all comment that, on the west of the Penobscot River, the Wabanaki were crop growers, right? There were big, fields of corn and other things. They actually, were agricultural people, not with fixed settlements. But when you got to Eastern Maine, they were all hunter-gatherers because you couldn't really use that crop growing strategy. Neither could the colonists, so it became much more dependent on lumbering and on fishing to survive, and a much more tenuous existence for the absence of the what was then an essential base of being able to do surplus farming. Having your own farm and being able to sell a surplus was not a reliable thing, which made it very difficult, especially in Washington County, for settlement to really take place. I mean, I love Washington County, but in some sense, you could say it was never really, hasn't been successfully colonized yet, right? The sparseness of the population along the seaboard is remarkable, right? The Bold Coast Preserve exists because nobody succeeded in really settling towns on it. And the
Well,
tide
and
and all the rest.
I wonder, you know, you talk about getting back to the summer people and the rusticators and how they sort of, that the underdevelopment of places like Acadia was sort of engineered by some of the people who had power. And that means that we have a lot of natural beauty and wealth that other places don't have. But is that also help contribute to the fact that the Wabanaki were able to hold on and remain in their homeland?
Oh, I mean, did that series for the Press Herald, Unsettled, about the Passamaquoddy's story over the most recent 50 years, you know, a harrowing story to, you know, report and to read about on its relationship with, you know, Maine and the majority of Maine population. But absolutely, you know, in the country to, you know, in the 1960s and the baby boomer generation when they were young, you know, most Passamaquoddy didn't necessarily speak English. That's how alive their own language was, which is pretty much unheard of in that time period for Native Americans on this side of the Mississippi River, right? That you would retain your language at all, better yet, that it would remain the dominant language. And part of that is precisely because, you know, the European settlement had not really succeeded very well at all. And so even though you were left as wards of the state and the situation was awful, the culture remained much more intact than almost anywhere on this side of the Mississippi. And that's a remarkable thing and asset. But you know, the story, the cruelty of the relationship with Maine and Mainers, which, you know, I sort of uncovered in Unsettled, that even though growing up in Maine, I wasn't aware of, you know, where, you know, people couldn't get their hair cut in Princeton if you were Passamaquoddy, where Passamaquoddy would be murdered and nobody would be held accountable, even if you knew who did it, where you call for an ambulance, and if you're calling from the Passamaquoddy reservation, the ambulance never comes because who cares, right? I mean, it was Mississippi burning brutal, but in, you know, Perry and Eastport. And that's sort of the starting point. So is, yes, the reason that you could have the level of coherence that existed was because, in a sense, of the fact that the physical conditions sort of stopped European colonization or slowed it down a great deal, but it did leave you know, not a very pleasant situation nonetheless.
A couple more questions. We're not going to have time to get to everybody's questions, but Susan Lipinski wants to know, what do you wish summer visitors to Maine would keep in mind about the state and its residents today?
Well, today I'd say, you know, wear your masks and follow the social distancing guidelines, right? Because we're not, you know, Maine is not just a backdrop for your vacation and your family's multi-generational nostalgia at your cottages. Real people live here, and we can get the coronavirus and die. So, you know, follow those recommendations. But fortunately, you know, I think, you know, I cover this stuff, the pandemic and the public health response, for the Portland Press Herald is kind of my beat. And, you know, thankfully, you know, they have, and Mainers generally have. You know, I know we all know people who don't do masks and don't agree with it, but enough people, both our visitors and our summer visitors and ourselves, have followed those recommendations, that somehow we got through an entire summer tourist season without any evidence of visitor/tourism generated outbreaks. You know, what happened? Well, our own, right, in Millinocket didn't follow the rules and have spread it to York County and may undo some of that. But we actually, from a summer tourism industry perspective, managed to pull that off. And, you know, the Bar Harbor area, you know, was famously, you know, forward thinking in trying to have its own testing regime for frontline tourism workers and to distribute masks and all that. I was up your way a couple of weeks ago, and I was amazed in Bar Harbor. You know, there were a lot of people in the third week of August in Bar Harbor, but everyone seemed to be complying that I saw on the streets, whether they're, you know, tourists, visitors, shopkeepers and stuff. You know, compliance rates very much similar to, you know, the greater Portland suburbs and stuff. And I saw that almost everywhere I went in my travels. So that's the good side of things.
We are going to end at 8:30. And before we let you go, Colin, any final words or last words for this audience? We're still almost at close to 200 people. Any final words?
Well, thanking you all for coming, and I guess just that I'm a believer in Maine, and that we're not second rate. We can do these things, and that we have, because of our level of civic engagement and the fact that people care about this place, we can do all those things. We can find ways to have a economy that functions at the local and municipal level and delivers those things, while at the same time protecting our sense of place and in the natural environment that is going to be among our most valuable resources going forward, when that becomes a rarer and rarer thing in this shrinking planet. And Mainers can do this, right? We're tinkerers, we're self-sufficient. We've had to invent things ourselves for lack of jobs and things coming to help, and we can apply those skills. We just need the convening and leadership to make that possible, which we've historically not been very good at. We need to learn to do it now, because we have the opportunities, and in this changing world, we really need to shore that up. And thank you all so much for coming and attending this talk. I wish we next time, I hope we're able to do this all in person.
Thank you so much. It's really been an honor to have you with us, Colin. Thanks again to HM Payson for sponsoring tonight's evening. Thanks to all of you for joining us and staying with us on this beautiful, maybe the last warm night. Please do check out our website, scudicinstitute.org, and support us if you can. Have a good night.
Thank you.